Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's show. And if you're joining for the first time, as you know, this spot is for the podcast series, and for which we invite a lot of different guests and talk about different topics that are happening in the community. Last week, we had Tim Martins. So if you have not checked his episode, he talks about change management and AI. So go and check that. For today, we have phenomenal guest, Kerry Lawrence from Desile, I guess. So she's going to introduce herself. So, Kerry, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Sam. And I'm really excited to chat with you this morning. So, as you said, Kerry Lawrence, CEO of Decile. We're an all-in-one customer data and analytics platform. And really our goal is to try to help brands leverage what we think is their most valuable marketing asset, that first-party customer data. So I know we're going to get a lot into that today and talk all about customer data platforms and analytics and how to best leverage that so that you can grow profitably and have great outcomes. And a little bit of history about me. Grew up in Virginia Beach, Virginia, not from a business family. My dad was a dentist. My mom was a teacher. But really, that was always a curious kid. Always wanted to know the why. It was constantly very kind of like a intellectual curiosity, if you will. And so I think it's natural that my career kind of took me into thinking about data and how to leverage that. Not just to answer questions, but for business outcomes as well. So I have roots in the agency world with more traditional media. It's kind of where I started with TV and radio. Yeah. Then I went to grad school to learn more about digital media and technology. And then I had a stint with Washington Post Digital on the publishing side. So I know that side of the world too. And then today I would think of myself almost as a serial entrepreneur. So I co-founded company called Social Code, which was known initially for social media advertising when it was very early days back in 2010. And then most recently at Decile, we spun out as a separate company in 2020. So again, very interested in thinking about data and how people can use that for business outcomes.
Okay, yeah, very interesting background, and I don't know how the episode is going to go, especially when you put two curious people in one episode. So we'll find out, I guess. Yeah. So if you're in the audience and if you have any sort of questions, please post them. Typically, they take priority on our episodes, as you might know if you have been joining our episodes. But before you post your questions, comments, we would love to know where you are joining from. So if you can post your locations. As well as we make progress in the episode, if you have any sort of experiences, stories that you are able to relate with, if you want to share those stories, especially from the B2C world, or if you have done any sort of data work from the CDP perspective, that will be awesome to hear. So again, Kerry, I'm going to go back to our today's topic, which is obviously CDP. That's the work that you do. And in my experience, when I compare the B2C space, it's just mind-blowing. I've read so many different books, and they talk about what brands have to do to promote their products. I mean, yes, that sounds crazy at the surface in terms of what they have to do. But, we have to use the stuff, they have to sell stuff, we have to run this world. So it's a crazy place to be in. It's very difficult, right? So overall, let's say if you look at the importance of customer data platforms, if people in my community is slightly more traditional ERP centric community, very bare bones transactions, and they don't necessarily understand what happens in the CRM world. What is customer data platform? Why do you need another platform called customer data platform? So maybe talk about the importance of the system a little bit and how B2C is different overall from the system architecture perspective.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. And I think one place to start is really thinking about how brands want to use their customer data. And so there's a couple key areas that I think are the primary use cases for why you would kind of engage with a customer data platform, really start thinking that way. The first is just what we think about as unifying. So really collecting and gathering data from all those key customer touch points along the way. So think your e-commerce channels, your retail stores, maybe from your email service provider, your SMS, like all those different touch points, trying to kind of pull and gather those together to get a sense of kind of what's happening with your customers. Again, I think for people who, as you said, are going direct to consumer, it's so important to just truly understand that customer. The next area I would think is a key use case is thinking of it as analyze. So, right, once you have all this data, you need to make sure, it's in a state where you can kind of make some sense of it, and starting to really make that data available for business intelligence, and even more so today, to help power AI and machine learning so that you can kind of, create a more personalized experience. I would say that the third use case is kind of around segmentation and personalization. That people are going to get annoyed. There's so much noise out there today. If you're just getting hammered with messages all the time and they're not personalized to you, what I don't want is someone texting me a very intimate channel saying, Carrie, come check out our brand. What I want is like, Carrie, we know you love, those button-down shirts, and they happen to be 20% off. And, it's just, the sale is, ready for you today. So that personalization is so huge. And then obviously activation. I think that's a place where a lot of people struggle today, to be honest, because they've got a lot of data. They have maybe their in-house analytics teams, but it's very difficult sometimes to connect that to activation and outcomes. And so you need to be able to kind of push that data into those key marketing platforms, whether it's like social media platforms for acquisition, think of like the Meta and the Googles of their TikToks, or if it's remarketing, which honestly in today's environment has become so important, because as acquisition costs continue to get more expensive, thinking about retention and how to get more juice out of your current customer base is really important.
So very interesting, and I'm going to peel some of the layers there overall. So I think you mentioned personalization, activation. So those are very interesting topics overall. So in my experience, and I'm going to tell you one story, and I don't know whether you recognize them as more CDP. So you probably can tell me because you come from this space. So I don't know if you are familiar with some called SAP Immersis. The SAP Immersis, they acquired this, I guess, a few years back. They wanted to get into, they have a CX cloud. I think you do a lot of work in the Salesforce Snowflake system, Snowflake ecosystem as well, right? So they have, as part of their Hybris is the e-commerce system, right? And as part of that, they have the Immersis, and that does the whole unifying aspect that you are talking about. And I don't know whether you do this more from the data perspective. So you have the data perspective, you also have the transactional perspective, meaning you need to unify this information, you need to personalize this information while processing these transactions. In general, in retail spaces, what I have personally seen, to be completely honest, is the data is fairly disconnected. The storefront is going to be on one data world, which is probably going to be on POS network. The e-commerce is sort of sitting in their own sort of data world. They have their own data silo, and generally they don't necessarily talk to each other. They sort of fake it.
Yeah, and that is the challenge for sure. I mean, I think and especially as you think about different size companies and kind of what that purchase journey sort of looks like, what we typically see is, when you're in that smaller growth stage. So, think about maybe in the 25 million annual revenue or below, they're just starting to, when you think about the e-com brands in particular, or even retailers, they're starting to think about, okay, I just need to figure out my commerce platform. So maybe I'm going to invest with and use Shopify for that. And then maybe the next baby step is, well, I need Google Analytics. I need some sort of analytics view. And then as you start to mature and get, upwards of think about like the 50 million threshold, that's where we really start to see people thinking like, okay, I need more advanced analytics on top of this. I need to understand not just about my customers, but who are my most valuable customers, which ones are really driving value to my brand. And then I need a way to kind of think about those, personas. And then you get a little bit, then you start to see people are like, okay, maybe they're in the 50 to 75 million range. And that's when they're like, I need a data warehouse. I need to start to really, to your point, like data's all over the place. I need to figure out kind of a central place. I need to have, all those components on top. I think, and then, again, as you continue to move up the spectrum, you can start to, pull and use the data in more advanced ways. I think the challenge is you hear a lot in market today about this concept of like what is a composable CDP,
Yeah.
right? And so I think as brands get larger, they have more data. Oftentimes they will think of everything as like a warehouse first strategy.
Yeah.
Great. But then they're investing in sometimes up, 5 or 6 different software platforms, someone to bring the data in and ingest it,
Yeah.
someone to do kind of the analytics and modeling. Then you've got the activation piece. So it can be very expensive. Sometimes it requires additional, headcount, technical headcount, resources. Yeah. So there is an argument to be made too about having more of a packaged or an all-in-one solution too. Yeah. And then as you kind of move up that chain, then thinking about how to get additional extensions.
Yeah, so very interesting commentary there. So obviously my understanding of the architecture that you are trying to describe, especially if they are building this whole data warehouse, is that is going to be slightly more after the fact, meaning you have already processed your transactions and now you are trying to bring all of this data in a data warehouse. And I don't know if in your space you see that the brands are also managing some of the external data. That's going to be beneficial as well. Okay, so number one, obviously you are sort of drawing the insights, and I don't know how you are going to be doing the activation. Maybe talk about that. What is activation from there? So here I'm getting some sort of insights that I need to utilize, and I don't know if you're using those for your transactional journeys or so maybe touch on that a little bit. Yeah.
I'll unpack that a little bit and tie it back, give a little more color to some of those use cases too. The other thing I would say is one thing to ask about as you're thinking about investing is like, is there a data enrichment component? As you kind of mentioned, are there other data sources, like being able to look at not just those purchase behaviors, but also those softer metrics, the demographic, psychographic, behavioral insights. That's going to help with some of that. So if you think about specific use cases, I want to talk about the unification piece at first. So we have a client who they're in the wellness space, have a subscription offering. And they said, we have data that's tied to kind of our customer NPS surveys. And so our hypothesis is that, those who have the highest NPS scores, who feel the strongest about our brand, are actually going to be our highest value customers. And so we want to pull that together to see if in fact that is the case. And so, we worked with them to do an exploration and, pull that in as another attribute. Really, you just need that match key. So when we talk about match keys, you're talking about a known identifier. So like an email address, phone number, etc. But what we found for this one particular brand was that actually the people who were reporting the highest satisfaction were not necessarily the highest value customers. So they really needed to deep dive, because obviously they want happy customers, but more importantly, they want to be growing profitably, keeping those subscription conversion rates high and reducing customer acquisition costs. So by truly identifying who were their true high value customers, they were able to do that in a much more efficient way. So another example of how someone might be using a customer data platform, thinking about the analyze piece. So then you need to be able to think about cohorting by any dimension. So I think a lot of times brands think it's enough just to understand your cohorts. So that segment of customers that you acquired, and they think about it just as like a time frame, like who did I acquire in March versus April versus May? Yeah. But you really want to be able to understand those cohorts by any dimension. So by gender, by age, by product purchase. So product analytics overlaid on customer analytics become very important. Yeah. So lots of different components. So an example of how a client might use this data. So we worked with a skincare brand, and they had traditionally had products that were meant just for men. And then they wanted to launch a line that was targeted towards women. Yeah. And so they shifted almost their entire marketing budget towards, launching these new products, really investing in growing this new segment while kind of ignoring the men in this case, like their old standbys. But then what they were able to do is look at actual lifetime value by gender, by males and females. And all of a sudden, their revenue started dropping when they were investing so much in this new female acquisition target. And so they realized that on average, the lifetime revenue for the men was $10 more than the women. So they said, okay, that's an aha moment. We need to shift some of that budget back to our old standbys. And then, they kind of righted the ship. So another great example. And then I would say, as I mentioned today, we hear brands are hyper-focused on retention marketing. And it's like your best customer is the one you already have, right? You want to continue to think about loyalty programs and how to personalize, what you're offering to those various cohorts. Gen Z might care about something very differently from a boomer, and what they want to see in their loyalty program. And then you also need to understand that journey. So is a customer lapsed? Are they active and actively repurchasing, which is what you want, those high repurchase rates? Or are they just kind of, they're on the edge of becoming lapsed and you need to re-engage them? So thinking about, you can use your data from that standpoint, from just a life cycle standpoint, to figure out when to time those remarketing messages. And then the activation piece that you were asking about, you really need those API integrations with those platforms to make it seamless. So you don't want to have everything so, I would say, disconnected from one another that just your analysts or your BI teams are kind of in the back creating models and looking at segments, but no one on your marketing team can do anything with it, right? So it's like you want to democratize that access and make sure that the platforms are connected so your workflows are seamless.
So very interesting. So I definitely want to touch a little bit more on that piece. So let's say if you are doing this API connection, so let's say if I have some sort of study here that I found out that, and by the way, I mean, interesting story about NPS versus the other cohort that, you were mentioning. And I don't know if you had any more discoveries there, why the technically, if you really think about it, if somebody is going to have higher NPS, then they would probably be higher value customers as well. Okay, I'm probably going to have one story from my perspective is, okay, if you have your friends and family, I mean, they are going to cheer you, but they're never going to swipe your credit card, I guess.
That's a great metaphor. Yes.
So I don't know if that was the case. So I don't know if you have any sort of more. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there were maybe just other attributes that were more meaningful towards determining that value. And so in other words, and that's where the enrichment piece comes into play too, because maybe it's like, okay, what was actually more important is that they were this gender and this demographic, or this persona of someone who, or maybe it was instead, someone who lived in this market. So it could be that they needed to unpack that a little bit more. The other thing that's important that a lot of people don't do when thinking about lifetime revenue and high value audiences versus is a lot of times people will just look at all their customers and look at the sum of all their purchases and say, okay, this is my highest value, but they haven't normalized it for time frame. So in other words, it looks like their oldest customers are their most valuable. And that's often not the case. So you need to make sure you think about setting those post-acquisition windows to compare more accurately. So if you really want to know how successful a new product launch or a new campaign was, think about looking at the cohort that was acquired during that time frame from that campaign, but then set like a 6-month post-acquisition window. And then you can compare that to all your different customer cohorts. So you can really start to understand, okay, relative to one another, are these more valuable or not?
So very interesting. So how does that normalization process works? Let's say if people are not familiar with that and they are thinking that my older customers are probably the best customers. So how would the process work for them and what benefit can they expect?
Yeah. And hopefully they'll work with someone like Desktop who can do this for them. But really just at a very high level, the process is you need to know when they first became a customer, when they made that first purchase. And then you just kind of set that time frame, whatever you want. So if it's 3 months out, 6 months out, most of our clients look at, I would say, a 6 to 12 month post-purchase like time frame. And then you look at all the purchases that were made during that time frame. What was the average order value? And so by like looking at all of those components, you can then understand a true value. Now you also need to take into account profitability, right? So if they're buying all your products that you have very, slim margins on, or they're returning a bunch of stuff like that, that's obviously not as valuable either. So it's important. Sometimes we see that people think lifetime revenue, which is a good starting spot, but the more sophisticated companies are also thinking about lifetime value in the sense of profitability. So taking taking cost of goods sold into account, what are they buying? Are they returning it? What are shipping costs? Taking all those pieces into account.
Okay, so very interesting. So one of the layers that I would like to hit on is, and I don't know if this is only applicable, when you have converted them and doing slightly more post-sales activity, or can you do this for your visitors as well? Either they left the cart or they didn't supply their emails. And for that, I guess you had one more layer, in the pre-show that we had discussed that, your the cookies as well as the first party data. So I don't know if that is being used to
The leads.
unify.
Yeah, you're asking about leads, not just purchasers or not just
Exactly,
customers. Yeah,
exactly.
it's a great question. So I would say that at Decile, we believe we're fully in the like known, known individual, known
Yeah,
customer world, and so we believe that that's the way my marketing is working. It is identity-based marketing. With that said, if you have a list, the main qualifier is that you need that identifier. So
yeah,
if you have emails, for instance, of people who so that's not always a website visitor, right? That's part
yeah,
of the risk with like cookies. So you need to get that first party data. But if you
yeah,
have emails from someone who's never made a purchase, but they're considered like a good lead, sure, we can pull that into the system too, and then track, when do they become a customer? Like, what does that journey look like? There's also lots of like attribution platforms out there too,
yeah,
that deal more in the kind of the web analytics space. We
yeah,
can integrate with Google Analytics, which is a helpful layer.
yeah.
But really, our belief is that your best setup, if you're thinking about those known individual users. So that is always my advice: is like no matter what size company you are, you
Yeah.
need to start collecting that first party data, because I think a lot of companies have sort of yielded that control
Yeah.
to marketing platforms, for instance, and
Yeah.
a lot of that is kind of aggregated performance and
Yeah.
so it's in measurement, so it's like you don't always know exactly what that journey is. And with cookies going away, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
like you can't really track your customers across the web anymore. So again, like you need to take control over that and start to build up those stores of your own data.
So yeah, so talk to us a little bit more about that. So how would you take the control back? So let's say if the cookies are not going to be there, so now you cannot really identify them. You are not going to have any sort of information about them, right? So let's say if I want to identify them, and by the way, so you are talking about known customers. I don't know what is going to be the percentage. So in my case, let's say if I'm a B2C brand, I'm trying to sell to a lot of consumers. My customers are probably going to be, I don't know how many I'm going to convert, maybe 2%, 3%, 10%. I don't know if anybody's converting, let's say 50%. So you are probably missing out on the 50% of the traffic. Your scenario where you are getting the email list, that's going to be slightly different, right? Because in that, you already know who you want to target, which is great. But then you also have the third segment of folks who have either visited or
Yeah.
they might be potential for you, but you don't sort of have their email address. So, but I mean, they are visiting your website, so they are engaging with you, but you don't know them yet.
Yeah.
So, without cookies, how would you identify them? I guess.
Yeah. Well, and I think you'll see a lot of brands starting to do this, probably even with your own, consumer journey. But what you'll see a lot of today is as soon as you come to a website, you hit a landing page that says, we'll give you 15 or 20% off your first purchase if you
Yeah.
give us your email address, or actually we'll give you an extra 10% off if you also give us your phone number. So you see those kind of like blocks. I mean, there's a way to get around them, obviously, and to X out, but a lot, it's a good way for companies to think about capturing that data. I think my belief is that if there's equal value exchange, if a customer feels like they're getting value from you, then they will happily, provide that information. But if you're not giving them value, then they're not going to do it. So I would say the most common tactic that we see today is what I just kind of described, which is, they're setting up landing pages and blocks to gather that known identity or that identifier, so that they can build up those stores.
Okay, very interesting. So, and I don't know how long you have been in this space, especially the customer data platform. I know you come from slightly more traditional agency world, right? So, what change? Go ahead. Go ahead. You have a comment?
No, I've been in digital since 2008. So however many years that is, 16 years, I think. So Decile was actually incubated within Social Code as like an
Yeah.
audience intelligence platform then. So
Yeah.
yeah, but so I know the space. I have the perspective from what are the publishers thinking about? What are the advertisers thinking about? And then, what are the e-com the brands thinking about? So, but yeah, so it's kind of a nice, well-rounded view of those perspectives.
Yeah, so very interesting. So the question that I really wanted to ask is, okay, so in these years, whatever time you have spent, I mean, technology has come a long way. Even today, I mean, you have AI and so many different changes that are happening in the marketplace. Before AI, obviously, composable is the term that you have used, headless, so many different things, right? So if you sort of draw the maturity curve of, let's say, CDP stack, so how would you do that? I mean, data warehouse technology is not new as such. We, had this before, so marrying that data is not very unique as such. But what are the changes that you are seeing in the marketplace? What are the options available for the customers, let's say, if they want to utilize something like CDP in their stack?
Yeah, I think the biggest shift is that there are options now that are more accessible for a smaller size brand. It used to be that unless you were willing to spend, $200,000 or $300,000 a year, and you're $100 million plus, company, it wasn't really available to you. Or like you had to, buy all these little, maybe you're doing LiveRamp for onboarding, and maybe you're getting third-party data from somewhere else. And, it wasn't really accessible. So I do think that now especially like the Shopify ecosystem has made it more accessible. So there's a lot of Shopify developers, Decile included. There's several others, obviously, that have made it so you don't need to do these 12 to 24 month contracts. You can do this on a month-to-month basis and really kind of test it out. Like in our case, like providing that third-party enrichment is essential to getting to the personas. And as you and I were talking about, like with AI, like machine learning's been around for a while now. I think that, but if you think about the differences, like the old model, and I harken back to my days working in traditional media, we worked with big brands. What they would do is they would spend $50,000 or $100,000 on a marketing research study. They would gather maybe like 10 or 12 people who looked like their customers, and ask them questions. And it was like you're making these huge multi-million-dollar decisions based on like 12, 20 people. Whereas like now it's like we've got all this data using the machines to help kind of cluster your customers into those various personas or segments. Like you can find those people who are like highest propensity to purchase, and like really pulling in the data science and the modeling pieces too, or who you can find the people who are your highest lifetime value, who's going to be not just the highest lifetime value today, but the highest predicted lifetime value a year from now. And so, you need the machines to do that. So I think to your point, like that's where we see the greatest evolution is, I think, more advancements in the advanced analytics pieces and using the machines to help really identify those customer cohorts that are going to be most valuable.
Yeah, very interesting. So let's talk about Shopify ecosystem a little bit more, I guess. So obviously these are going to be slightly smaller customers.
That's not true anymore, Sam. We have like billion-dollar brands that are on Shopify. So I think what their goal is to move more upstream too. But traditionally, you're right. You think of people, I think of Shopify as like 25 million or 50 million and less. But now all the big brands, what they're realizing is they don't want to spend all this money building their own tech, commerce or checkout experience. It's super expensive. So they're like saying, okay, I'm just going to find, and not always Shopify, but like that they're the market leader. I'm like, we see really big brands replatforming over to Shopify just for cost savings.
Yeah. So, I mean, honestly speaking, like the space that we play in, even $1 billion brand is probably going to be relatively smaller in terms of their tech spend.
Okay. Yeah, we're in slightly different ICPs, I guess.
So what the point I was trying to make is, so let's say if you're in the Shopify ecosystem, and obviously they are going upstream. I mean, the up market, I know that, they have changed their product model as well. And now we are going to see a lot more enterprise logos. And you're definitely right that they have logos for $1 billion company as well. And overall, when you look at the tech stack, so obviously you have CDP, and I don't know whether you feel that this is going to be more of the data analytics layer. That's how I'm perceiving that that CDP resides in that. I don't know how many CRMs are there in the B2C space. Do you even need CRM for your CDP to work? So maybe touch on that a little bit. Where does CRM sort of fit in this particular space? Because if you compare this with your B2B architecture, you are going to have your CRM, marketing automation,
Yeah.
engagement, etc. And they do a little bit of data, but not as much as your B2C, because B2C you're going to have a lot more data sets in general, right?
Yeah, we work with both. So obviously, like bigger brands that are not on Shopify as well, and like so when companies think about their CRM, you're absolutely right that some of them, if you're just like smaller, you're just on Shopify, you just need a way to like manage that first party data. So that's what I was saying. Like those folks are almost using like Shopify as their like store or Google Analytics to understand kind of customers. But then, a lot of people think of their email service provider, like a Klaviyo or something like as their CRM of where they're kind of like storing and managing that data. Salesforce Commerce Cloud, going up a little bit more upstream. But I think that again, like sometimes the disjointedness is you think of traditional CDPs and where we're trying to like carve out kind of our lane. But sometimes it's like you think of the traditional CDPs as just kind of a way to like they're pipes basically to move the data into various destinations or to do the segmentation. And then there were like there's other groups that maybe have been traditionally more focused on just being analytics tools, but there's no connection to the activation, or, they're not able to kind of do more of the sort of advanced modeling stuff. So it's like bringing those pieces together, whether it's an all-in-one package deal or if you're doing the composable route, there's pros and cons of both. I think generally like thinking about warehouse first strategy is where to kind of start. And then you don't want to just have your analytics disjointed from that.
Yeah, very interesting. In your experience, when you are dealing with, and I don't know if you understand what SNOP platforms are. So that is going to be your sales and operations planning. Generally, they are part of the supply chain stack. I don't know if you see those in your space. Generally, their role, no?
No, I mean, I'm fully aware. And like, when people using the, supply chain logistics and the 3PLs and stuff. So like, yes, like, do I run into those as much? Sometimes, but I think that's an interesting space for the AI development too, actually, with scenario planning and that sort of thing.
So let's say if we compare this with CDP and how, I don't know how they are going to compare. Obviously, their role is going to be for the sales and operations planning in general, what they are trying to find out, especially if I look at B2C space, which is going to be very commerce driven. It's going to be very retail driven, in that their role is going to be to identify demand. You mentioned the term warehouse, right? So in this particular case, the warehouse is going to be a store that they are trying to forecast, okay, how much the store is going to need on a daily basis, so that they can ship the inventory that they need to have at the store. So if somebody walks in, then they can supply that, right? So this is going to be slightly more at the macro. It's not macro, but it's macro, from your perspective at least, right? The space that you deal in, that's going to be slightly different, right? I mean, you cannot do whatever you are doing inside the SNOP platform just because you are going literally at the consumer level.
Yeah, that's right. I think especially for our use case, like we're custom built for marketers. So I think like the marketing use cases, with that said, where you see the crossovers, I think is the product analytics overlaid on top of the customer analytics. So we'll have a lot of like, a head of merchandising or something that's in our tool. And they're also using the tools that you're talking about. And they're thinking about like all the, supply chain pieces and the operations folks. But then they also want to understand which products are purchased together. What does that sequential product purchase path look like? Because that informs inventory decisions, right? Or which products are bringing in the highest value customers. I think the key is like from someone who is in that like kind of COO, CFO suite is to really think about like, how can I make it easiest for everyone in my company to be like analytics minded and data centric? And like, is there a place where this could all come together to kind of help drive those decisions?
Okay, very interesting. Have you seen any other industry crossovers in general? In particular industry, you are going to have a lot more need than the other one. So let's say even among B2C or DTC industries, if you compare beauty versus apparel, I don't know. Do you see a lot more use case of CDP in one particular micro industry than the other?
I mean, I think what we see a lot of more is like almost like finding like different app developers for custom, activities. So like someone who's really going to manage the returns piece, or someone who's going to manage this piece. Like there's not a huge crossover between the two main, the CDP and then like the inventory piece and the supply chain folks. It's like, I think that where it comes together is with the data and insights. But I do think that there is a world where all of this starts to come together. Where it gets challenging again is just like the cost and expense. And so like thinking about, how you build your stack is something that people need to be mindful of. But it's funny when I go to like a lot of e-commerce conferences, for instance, you always have like the panel on, future of e-com, or you have the AI discussion, and you have the supply chain and inventory management discussion, and like you have all of those pieces. So it is something that they're mindful of. I think the same way that I would say like, take marketers or brands should take more control over their first party data is from a marketing standpoint. I think that's important from a supply chain standpoint too. So I remember being on a panel with some folks who are like, that used to all be outsourced. But then when you have, where you're, negotiating these large contracts, or you're dealing with supply chain delays and stuff, the more that you can kind of control the pieces of that process, they were better positioned.
Okay, so let's talk about two different stories that are happening right now, and I want to know how that is going to impact your world. Okay, so I don't know whether you heard the rumor, and I don't know if it is a rumor or it's real. Okay, so OpenAI is launching their search engine, right? That's what they are saying, that they are probably going to announce on Monday, and it is going to be in direct competition of Google. And I don't know how that is going to change the world. I don't know if they are going to have cookie. My guess, and the best guess right now, is going to be that right now OpenAI is sort of guarded because you need to log in to be able to search. So now they are probably opening up for public. That's what they are going to do, and it's going to be just the search, and obviously it's going to be slightly more search friendly, right? So how is that going to change your world? And I'll give you the second story is related to HubSpot, so we can come back to that later. But Google acquiring HubSpot, so that's going to be the second one that I need to ask.
Yeah, I mean, I think Google's a little bit under fire right now, to be honest. And I think like they have just dominated search for so long. And certainly OpenAI and Microsoft is very well positioned to kind of start to lead in that space. And that's why you do see so many investments in that world. But even like TikTok or Pinterest, like they're starting to like, that's becoming the point of search for, the younger generations too. So I definitely think that, yeah, it's gonna be a real game changer. I think if I was the leader at Google right now, I would be certainly a little sweat beneath my brow.
Yeah, so there are more changes happening in the world of Google. And again, one of the things that they have announced is now they are actually pumping all of your Instagram URLs as well as TikTok URLs to Google. So now Google search is able to see all of those as well. And I don't know if that impacts anything.
That's smart. I mean, for our world, all these changes are good. Like, especially like cookies going away is another one that I knew, but like, forcing people to think more about their own first party data and collection positions us well. I think Google, that's super smart to pull in those feeds, as you were saying, with like, because like they need to not ignore where customers are spending their time and where people, where they want to engage. You hear a lot of like meet your customer where they are. And I think that's going to become increasingly important. And I think the other big trend that we see that people don't think about with e-com is as you go up the spectrum, as you become a larger e-com brand, these companies that kind of started out being just like digitally native, 100% online, they're now kind of swinging the other way. So they're starting to open up strategic storefronts and retail environments too, because they know that's where their most profitable customers are. That's where it serves as like almost like, a branding or a television ad, because you can see the storefront. And so I think that there's less hubris around amongst all the different channels on like, this is the one place and this is like the future. It's more like, what are customers doing and how do we like aligned to that. So I think that's what it is important to notice those behaviors. But I think it's really interesting because like, malls are kind of, those are dead. That concept is out, but more like strategic storefront in certain markets, or as you said, Google pulling in those Pinterest and TikTok feeds. Like I think that's good.
Okay, very interesting. Do you have any other stories that you wanted to share that you would like to share, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the best advice that I would have for brands and marketers or people in charge of purchasing decisions is like, again, really think about sort of that warehouse first mindset and how you can democratize access to data for your entire company. I think that where we see, people who are not future-proofing themselves and not being able to take advantage of personalization are those who don't have those first-party assets. Now, that gets a little complicated if you're someone who, needs to sell in the third-party marketplaces like an Amazon or Walmart too, because they're holding that data. They know how important that data is, and they're holding that close to the vest. And so you have to kind of balance that, right? You need to have an e-commerce channel so you can collect that, first party data, but maybe you also need the scale of something like an Amazon or a Walmart. So I was just doing a panel prep with a group for an upcoming panel in LA recently, and they were, I think one of the marketers said, it's like, there's just more and more things to try to keep track of, but like everyone's just kind of like trying to stay ahead of the game and make sure. So the advice is honestly just learn what your customers are doing and be where they are.
Okay, amazing. And do you want to share how people can find you? That's a wrap. I mean, we are close to our time right now. So
yeah, no, this has been so fun, Sam. Thank you. So decile.com, you can, book a demo, contact us form right there. Reach out to me personally, Carrie at decile.com. I'd love to hear from you and answer any questions and engage in these important topics.
Okay, amazing. And my personal takeaway from this episode is that CDP is really powerful. So at least learn about that, figure out how you might be able to take advantage of that. On that note, that's it for this episode. We'll come back next Friday or Thursday for another episode. So stay tuned for that. On that note, thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in today.
Thanks, Sam.
Of course.